50 years after the last helicopters lifted off from Saigon, after the shouting crowds, the panicked evacuations, and the final thump of rotor blades disappeared into the gray April sky, one question still hangs in the minds of the men who made it home. Who decided which lives mattered more in Vietnam? It wasn't philosophy. It wasn't politics. It wasn't debated in classrooms or argued over in smoky bars. It was answered at dawn, every single day, because each morning, somewhere in the steaming jungles of Vietnam, a platoon leader would look over his squad and ask the same quiet, deadly, simple question, whose walking point? For most Americans today, the term barely registers, but for the men who were there, the meaning is carved into memory with a blade. Walking point meant stepping into the jungle first alone, 5, 10, sometimes 20 meters ahead of the column. It meant your boots touched the ground before anyone else's. Your body tested the trail before anyone else committed to it. You were the first shadow the enemy would see, the first silhouette that lined up in a sniper's sights, the first pair of feet to catch a mine, a tripwire, or a grenade rigged to a vine. In Vietnam, the point man was the man most likely to die. The numbers were brutal. Point men carried the highest casualty rate of any job in the infantry. First to spot the enemy meant first to trigger the ambush. First to smell danger meant first to bleed. Sometimes they lasted weeks, sometimes days, sometimes minutes. And yet this is the part nobody outside the military ever understands. Some men kept volunteering. Again, and again, and again. Why? That becomes the heart of the story. Most units, at least early in the war, treated point duty like a punishment rotation. You screwed up, you mouthed off, you were new, fine walk point. The logic was cold, calculated, and devastatingly common. Better to risk the green kid up front than your seasoned rifleman you couldn't afford to lose. Marines had a grim phrase for it. Put the expendable guys up front. The math seemed to make sense, at least to the officers making the decisions. But the jungle didn't care about anyone's math. It didn't care who was expendable or who was irreplaceable. It didn't care about rank or reasons or fairness. It swallowed men whole without hesitation. In the Central Highlands, under triple-canopy jungle so thick the sun barely broke through, point men walked far enough ahead that their world existed separately from the men behind them. 20 meters might as well have been a mile. By the time the column realized something was wrong, the point man was already bleeding into the dirt. The jungle muted everything. Light, sound, breath, hope. It was a green cathedral of death, and the point man walked down the center aisle every morning alone. Behind him, 30 or so men depended on a single human set of senses, the ability to see a twig hanging at the wrong angle, to catch a glint of metal buried in the leaves, to hear the birds stop singing half a second before gunfire erupted. The responsibility was crushing, crushing enough to break men, crushing enough to reshape them. Because walking point didn't just change your odds of dying, it changed your mind. Some point, men developed a heightened awareness that seemed impossible to explain. They noticed shifts in the jungle that training manuals didn't cover. They felt tension in the air before an ambush materialized. They sensed danger before signs appeared. It wasn't mystical, it was survival instinct, sharpened by terror, repetition, and one simple truth. If you missed something, everybody else paid the price. It didn't take long for a few men in Vietnam to realize the devastating flaw in the Army's strategy. The problem wasn't the job. It was who they were putting in that position. What if walking point didn't have to be a death sentence? What if the right man, skilled, calm, experienced, could actually turn the most dangerous job into the safest one for the rest of the squad? What if point wasn't punishment, but responsibility? What if it demanded the best man, not the newest? That radical idea, unthinkable in 1965, would eventually transform how America's most elite units fought. It would become modern doctrine, and it would save countless lives. But back then, in the humid mornings of Southeast Asia, long before Hollywood and history tried to make sense of this war, it started as a whisper among the men who walked first. A quiet rebellion against the idea that some lives were worth more than others. A rebellion started by men like Chief James Watson, A SEAL who would redefine how point was walked, and by men like Tennessee, a skinny kid in the Army who moved through the Vietnam jungle as if he'd been born from it. Their choices, their instincts, and their sacrifices would change everything. This is their story. The story of the men who walked first and carried that weight for the rest of their lives. Before Chief Watson, before the elite teams rewrote doctrine, before anyone understood what was truly happening out there, the U.S. military approached point duty with a kind of cold arithmetic that only makes sense on a whiteboard or inside an air-conditioned operations tent. To the boots on the ground, it was madness. In the early years of the Vietnam War, the Army and Marine Corps treated point like you'd treat kitchen duty or latrine detail, something you rotated to keep things fair, something to get through and forget. Except this wasn't scrubbing pots or filling sandbags. This was stepping into the jaws of the jungle and hoping they didn't close on you. Most units didn't assign point based on skill. They assigned it based on convenience. If you just arrived in country, you went to the front. If you were a replacement, still terrified, still trying to remember the names of the men around you, you went to the front. If you pissed off your squad leader last night or fell asleep on guard duty, guess where you were walking tomorrow? Point wasn't a job. It was punishment. Marines had a saying, half joke, half truth, 100% lethal. Put the expendable guys up front. They said it with a shrug, sometimes a nervous laugh, but the reality behind those words was horrifying. The expendable guy up front wasn't the only one who died when things went bad. He was just the first, because once the point man hit a mine, stepped into a kill zone, or triggered an ambush, everyone behind him paid the price, and the enemy knew it. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army were masters of terrain and patience. They built entire landscapes designed to consume the first soldier who stepped into them. A single misstep by the point man was all it took for chaos to rip down the entire column. In theory, the rotation system made sense to officers who saw war in terms of charts and parity. Everyone shares the risk. Nobody is unfairly burdened. But in practice, Vietnam wasn't a classroom. It wasn't a chessboard. It was a primordial jungle that punished inexperience without mercy. The first hour a man walked point, he was a liability. The second hour, slightly less. By the end of a week, maybe he had instincts forming. But then his rotation ended, and the next guy, fresh, nervous, unprepared, was shoved up front. And the cycle repeated, over and over, until someone died. In many platoons, men watched 3, 4, 5-point men get hit within their first weeks. The shock never faded. You could hear it in the way a squad fell silent the moment the lieutenant said the words, "All right, who's got point?" No one wanted to raise their hand. Every man hoped someone else would volunteer. Eyes dropped to the ground. Boots shuffled. Breath held. Because everyone knew the truth, nobody said out loud, point man wasn't survival. Point man was sacrifice. And this fear created something toxic, something that infected entire units. Men began to resent the guys who weren't chosen. They grew superstitious about who was cursed on point. Some believed certain men always walked into trouble, while others seemed to repel it. The jungle fed that paranoia. And paranoia, in a place like Vietnam, could be just as deadly as any mine. The worst part? Most of those expendable guys were teenagers. 19, 18, some even 17. Boys who just weeks earlier were flipping burgers or mowing lawns were suddenly expected to lead seasoned combat veterans through some of the deadliest terrain on Earth. And the veterans hated it, but not for the reasons you might think. It wasn't because the new guys slowed the patrol down. It wasn't because their mistakes brought attention. It was because the older men had seen what happened when an inexperienced point man missed the signs that should have screamed danger. They had seen how fast a patrol could vanish into gunfire. They had seen the aftermath of one wrong footstep. They had carried the wounded or the dead back to the LZ. They knew the brutal truth the rotation system ignored. The jungle did not grade on a curve. It did not care about fairness. It cared only about competence. And so resentment wasn't jealousy. It was fear. Fear of watching a kid barely old enough to vote be sent forward to do a job he hadn't had time to learn. Fear of being second in line behind someone who didn't yet understand how the jungle breathed, how it whispered when danger was close, or fell silent when death waited around the bend. Veterans knew what officers didn't. On the trail, experience was the only armor that mattered. Yet the command structure refused to see it. They believed discipline and order were enough. They believed the jungle could be learned in a classroom. They believed a soldier was a soldier was a soldier. But Vietnam was the great equalizer. It didn't care about rank or training scores. It exposed weakness ruthlessly. And in those early years, weakness walked point. Not because it wanted to, not because it volunteered, but because the system demanded it. This was the deadliest mistake of the war. A mistake the enemy exploited. A mistake the men on the ground suffered for. And a mistake that one man, Chief James Watson, would soon decide to challenge with everything he had. The first time Chief James Jim Watson set foot in Vietnam, he wasn't the kind of man you expected to change the way America fought a war. He wasn't loud. He wasn't the swaggering, larger-than-life stereotype Hollywood paints onto every Navy SEAL. If anything, he blended into the background, quiet eyes, steady posture, the calm presence of someone who understood himself better than most men ever would. But beneath that calm was something else. A mind that did not accept stupidity just because it was tradition. A man who refused to sacrifice others just because the rulebook said so. When Watson arrived in the Mekong Delta in 1966, SEAL Team 1 was still young, still figuring out how to wage an unconventional war in a place that seemed designed to kill Americans. The Delta was a labyrinth of black water, mangrove roots, and mud thick enough to swallow a man whole. The Viet Cong didn't just fight there, they lived there. They had tunneled through it, memorized it, mastered it. And yet, despite all that, the American military had brought with it one of the most dangerous assumptions of the entire war. Anyone can walk point. Watson took one look at that belief and knew it was insanity. He'd watched inexperienced men pushed to the front like bait. He'd watched good squads lose their best fighters because the worst fighters were put in the most critical position. He'd seen officers stand over maps and talk about acceptable losses, as if death was an accounting error. To Watson, this wasn't strategy. It was negligence. And he wasn't a man who tolerated negligence. He spoke softly, but when he spoke, people listened. Because Watson had credibility you couldn't fake. He'd grown up in the woods of the American South, hunting and tracking long before the Navy ever taught him anything. He understood terrain the way musicians understand rhythm. Subtle changes, patterns, disturbances, tone. A hunter can tell when a forest is wrong before he ever sees the animal. Vietnam worked on the same principles, only the prey wasn't deer. It was men. It was simple, revolutionary, borderline insane to anyone who'd grown up inside traditional military doctrine. The most experienced man should walk point. Not the least. Not the newest. Not the screw-ups. Not the guys the unit could afford to lose. The best man. The one who could read the jungle. The one who could spot danger while it was still just a whisper. The one with instincts sharpened by years, not days in hostile terrain. Because, Watson argued, the point man wasn't a tripwire. He wasn't a sacrificial offering. He was a guide, a shield, a human early warning system. And if he did his job right, everyone behind him lived. To Watson, the math was obvious. Skilled point man equals fewer contacts, fewer casualties, fewer body bags. Unskilled point man equals high chance of walking into an ambush. So why, he kept asking, would anyone put the least skilled soldier in the most skilled position? To the SEALs around him, the idea sounded noble but risky. Losing your best operator could cripple a team. What if Watson ate a booby trap on day 3? What if he caught a burst of AK fire? What if the team lost the man who'd saved them time and time again? Their fear was rational, but Watson's response was devastatingly logical. If the point man isn't the best, you'll lose more than just him. One skilled point man could prevent entire firefights. One unskilled point man could create them. The team began to listen. The proof came in the swamps. Watson didn't argue with charts or theories. He argued with results. He volunteered for point, Again, and again, and again, not because he wanted to be a hero. Watson hated that word, but because he knew something the command structure hadn't figured out yet. Experience saves lives. Inexperience costs them. Soon, the other SEALs started noticing the way Watson moved. The way he paused mid-step because a vine hung wrong. The way he froze because the birds had suddenly gone silent. The way he chose one canal over another for reasons he couldn't fully articulate but were always right. It wasn't magic. It was attention. It was instinct refined into a survival mechanism. Mission after mission, SEAL Team 1 came back whole. Patrols that should have ended in blood ended in silence. Ambushes that should have sprung stayed dormant. Booby traps that should have detonated remained untouched. The pattern was undeniable. Watson on point equals squad intact. Word spread. A new philosophy is born. Other SEAL teams began asking quiet questions. How is Watson doing it? What signs is he picking up? What should we be looking for? Watson didn't keep secrets. He taught anyone who asked. He broke down the tricks of the jungle, the broken spiderwebs, the fresh cuts on vegetation, the unnatural quiet. He showed them the difference between a game trail and a killing corridor. He taught them to feel danger before they saw it. And slowly, something extraordinary happened. Walking points stopped being a punishment. It became a responsibility, a role of honor, a job for the sharpest mind, the calmest nerves, the most experienced operator. Watson flipped the logic of an entire war on its head, and the ripple would reach all the way from the mangrove swamps of the Mekong Delta to the doctrines of America's most elite special operations units. But Watson wasn't the only man rewriting the rules. Hundreds of miles away, deep in the triple-canopy jungles of the Central Highlands, someone else was reaching similar conclusions. A skinny kid the platoon called Tennessee, a point man who moved like he was born from the jungle itself. His story would reveal the other half of the truth Watson discovered, and together they would redefine what it meant to walk first. By the time Chief James Watson had settled into his role in the Mekong Delta, something remarkable had begun happening on his patrols, something so subtle and so consistent that eventually even the hard-bitten SEALs around him couldn't ignore it. They stopped getting ambushed. Not because the enemy wasn't trying, not because the VC were any less skilled, or less patient, or less committed to controlling the swampy maze they called home. They stopped getting ambushed because Watson saw everything before it happened. And he didn't see danger the way normal men did. He didn't spot a tripwire because he was lucky, or catch the glint of a rifle barrel because the sun hit it just right. His awareness didn't come from superstition or some sixth sense. It came from decades of paying attention to the natural world, a lifetime of learning the quiet language of forests and riverbanks, and then applying that language to the deadliest battleground of the Vietnam War. Most Americans who deployed to Vietnam saw the jungle as hostile, chaotic, overwhelming. It was too loud, too dense, too alive. Every rustle sounded like danger. Every shadow stretched too long. Every quiet moment felt like it was hiding something. But Watson didn't see chaos. He saw patterns. The jungle, to him, was a living system, one that reacted instantly to human intrusion. When the VC moved through an area, they disturbed that balance in ways almost invisible to the untrained eye. To a hunter like Watson, those disturbances glowed like lanterns. A spider web broken too cleanly. A vine hanging 1 inch too low. Mud that was glossy instead of matte, meaning it was touched recently. A log that should have algae but didn't. Water that rippled against the current instead of with it. Most men walked past these signs without ever noticing them. Watson treated them like road signs, and when he saw enough signs in a short distance, he knew exactly what they meant. Stop! Danger ahead! On one patrol, Watson froze mid-step in a stretch of mangrove so thick the branches clawed at their uniforms like fingers. His teammate behind him nearly ran into his back. "Why'd you stop?" the slackman whispered. Watson didn't answer. He was staring at a vine, just a normal vine, brown and rough and sagging with the humidity. Except it wasn't normal. It hung at too perfect an angle. The weight distribution didn't match the plant around it. Something had been tied to it. 30 seconds later, after Watson's mind pieced the clues together, he spotted the sharpened bamboo punji stake buried under leaves, rigged to swing up chest high if someone brushed the vine. A step farther, and that vine would have dragged a razor-edged spear into the ribcage of the man behind him. But, thanks to Watson, no one touched it. This scene repeated again and again. Watson stopping because the birds went quiet too suddenly, because the wind sounded wrong, because the water smelled too fresh, because the mud didn't match yesterday's color. Danger wasn't something he looked for. It was something he felt first, then confirmed with his eyes. Most military intelligence in Vietnam came from maps, captured documents, informants, and radio intercepts. Watson's intelligence came from the earth itself. He could tell how many men had passed through a trail by the spacing of footprints. He could tell how long ago they passed based on how the mud settled. He could tell if the enemy was scouting, patrolling, or preparing an ambush based on the depth of heel imprints. He had become, in effect, a human reconnaissance drone decades before the military built one. That wasn't luck. That wasn't fate. That was discipline. The most important skill Watson possessed wasn't shooting or swimming or hand-to-hand combat. It was noticing the smallest detail, even under extreme stress. And that detail-focused calm became the emerging doctrine of SEAL Team 1. Watson's teammates started asking questions. What do fresh cuts look like? How do you spot disturbed water? What does it mean if the frogs stop croaking? How do you tell a natural trail from a deliberate funnel? And Watson, unlike many men with rare talent, shared everything. He believed knowledge unshared was a life wasted. He walked others through the patterns he saw. Broken spider webs equals someone passed within hours. Silenced birds equals enemy presence. Angled vines equals booby traps. Soft mud with clean edges equals recent footprints. Oil sheen on water equals someone crossed with equipment. Bent reeds gleich hidden firing lanes. This wasn't mystical jungle wisdom. It was pattern recognition sharpened by repetition. And the more the SEALs learned to see these patterns, the fewer of them died. Soon, the philosophy spread. Walking point wasn't the job of the unlucky. It was the job of the most capable. And Watson proved, mission after mission, that skill could defeat probability. By 1967, SEAL units across the region had heard about Watson's way. Other teams adopted his methods. Ambush rates dropped. Survival rates improved. The old doctrine crumbled under the weight of undeniable results. The U.S. military didn't know it yet, but the standard for modern special operations had just been born, not in a classroom, but in the mud and mangroves of the Mekong Delta. But while Watson was reshaping warfare in the South, a different kind of point man hundreds of miles to the north was quietly achieving the impossible. A kid the platoon called Tennessee, moving through the triple-canopy jungle of the Central Highlands like the forest itself had chosen him. His story would reveal the other half of the truth Watson discovered. And it would prove that genius on point didn't come from training alone. Sometimes it came from transformation. By early 1967, something strange was happening in the riverine swamps of the Mekong Delta. It wasn't dramatic, not the kind of thing commanders noticed from headquarters, or the kind of shift that made its way into official reports, but the SEALs on the ground felt it in their bones. They were coming home from missions without casualties. That didn't mean Vietnam had suddenly become less lethal. The Viet Cong were still relentless, the booby traps still everywhere, and the ambushes still knife-sharp. But one variable had changed. The man walking point was no longer chosen by rotation. He was chosen by skill, and his name was Chief James Watson. At first, it was just Watson's team benefiting from this philosophy. But rumors in war move faster than radio transmissions. And, in a tight-knit community like the early SEALs, they move even faster. Before long, other platoons started asking questions. How the hell is Team 1 getting through Mangrove 9 without getting chewed up? Why aren't they hitting the same ambush patterns we're walking into? Who the hell is this Watson guy? What started as curiosity soon turned into imitation, and imitation became evolution. The SEAL teams operating in the Delta worked dangerously close to each other, sometimes sharing staging areas, sometimes running night ops within earshot. They saw the aftermath of each other's missions. Wounded men limping off boats, gunshot holes in hulls, blood on the deck, or if luck ran, cruel body bags. And they saw Watson's team come back clean. Not untouched, but unbroken. It didn't take long for one of the more open-minded platoon leaders to walk over to Watson after a debrief. "Chief," he said, "I hear you're doing something different on point." Watson didn't brag. He didn't boast. He didn't talk about instincts or gifts. He simply explained the logic. "You don't put your worst man at the most important position," he said. "You put your best." The other leader blinked. "That's not how the Navy does it." Watson shrugged. "It's how I do it." And that was that. Within weeks, more teams started trying it. Some were hesitant. Some rotated between two best men to avoid burning anyone out. Others copied Watson exactly. The results were undeniable. Ambush dropped. Booby traps were spotted earlier. Firefights became rarer and shorter when they happened. Teams stopped losing men on routine patrols. It was the kind of pattern even the skeptics couldn't ignore. Before long, SEALs were lining up to learn from Watson quietly, informally, without paperwork or official acknowledgement. They watched him move through the mangroves. They watched how he placed his feet, how he scanned, how he froze not out of fear but calculation. He taught them everything he could put into words. How mangroves remember when someone passes through them. How water settles strangely where a boat has crossed recently. How silence can be more dangerous than noise. How forest birds react differently to humans than they do to snakes. But the most important lesson couldn't be spoken. It had to be lived. "Don't look for danger," Watson would say. "Let it reveal itself." To the untrained ear, that sounded mystical, like some backwoods Zen mantra. But Watson wasn't a mystic. He was practical. What he meant was simple. Your conscious mind will get you killed. Your subconscious will save you. The more patrols a man walked, the more patterns his subconscious collected. And eventually, if he was calm enough, he'd start feeling those patterns before he consciously recognized them. It wasn't telepathy. It was experience outpacing thought. And the teams that embraced this idea began developing point men of their own men, who could sense ambushes before they materialized, who could smell danger, who could detect subtle shifts that others missed. Watson hadn't just changed a tactic. He had changed how SEALs saw the battlefield. You don't rewrite doctrine with memos. You rewrite it with results. The Navy didn't call a meeting or issue a formal directive. There was no headline, no announcement, no official Watson rule. Instead, the transformation happened organically, ground up, from the men whose lives depended on it. By late 1967, most SEAL units in the region had adopted the same philosophy. The point man is a specialist position. He is the protector of the team. He is the one with the most experience, not the least. You didn't walk point because your turn was up. You walked point because you were the best at it. And for the first time in Vietnam, walking first wasn't shame. It wasn't punishment. It wasn't a death sentence. It was honor. The Marines would take much longer to change. The Army even longer. But the SEALs, small, flexible, unconventional, were the ideal incubator for Watson's philosophy. And the results reverberated through generations. The Rangers would adopt it. Then the Green Berets. Then Delta Force. Then virtually every elite American unit operating in environments where one misstep could kill a dozen men. Watson didn't know it then, but he was building the foundation of modern Special Operations Point doctrine, the idea that the most experienced operator always leads. He didn't do it for medals. He didn't do it for glory. He did it because the alternative was watching his brothers die unnecessarily. But miles away in a different hell, the triple-canopy jungles of the Central Highlands, another man was proving the same philosophy in a completely different way. A young soldier the platoon called Tennessee. He didn't have Watson's training. He didn't have SEAL gear or riverine tactics, but he had something else, something raw, instinctive, and almost otherworldly. And his journey would show that Watson's philosophy wasn't just right. It was universal. While Watson was rewriting SEAL doctrine in the swamps of the Mekong Delta, A completely different war was unfolding hundreds of miles to the north. The Mekong was hell in water. The Central Highlands were hell in green. If the Delta was a labyrinth, the Highlands were a living fortress, towering mountains, knife-edged ridgelines, and jungles so thick you couldn't see 10 feet ahead even at noon. The air was heavy, wet, and unmoving, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. The NVA didn't just know this terrain, they owned it. They'd spent years digging spider holes, weaving tripwires into roots, and hiding sniper lanes behind curtains of leaves. Into that environment walked a fresh soldier named Olander, wide-eyed, exhausted, and already questioning the decisions that had brought him halfway across the world. His platoon ran point the old-fashioned way, by rotation. 2 hours at the front, switch. 2 hours at the front, switch. Fair on paper, fatal in practice. Because in the Central Highlands, the jungle didn't care whether a man had walked point for 2 hours or 2 months. If he missed the signs, he was dead. And if he was dead, chances were good the men behind him were next. It didn't take long for Olander to understand the brutality of this system. In his first month, he watched 3-point men get hit in rapid succession. The first stepped on a bouncing Betty. The second walked right into a sniper's sightline. The third simply disappeared, swallowed into a spider hole so fast no one even saw it open. One moment he was there. The next, gone. The jungle ate him. And the platoon realized something horrifying. Every time they rotated point, the man walking into that position was effectively starting from zero. New territory, new angles, new threats, new rhythms. By the time he understood what the jungle was saying, his rotation was over. And the next poor guy had to begin the same deadly learning curve. This wasn't just inefficient. It was suicidal. Even the platoon sergeant, an old-school, follow-the-book type, couldn't ignore what was happening. After the third casualty, he made a quiet decision that didn't appear in any manual. We're done with rotation. I want volunteers. We need consistency up front. Most soldiers avoided eye contact. Everyone understood what volunteering meant. But one man stepped forward. And then he didn't step back. Entered Tennessee. His real name didn't matter in Vietnam. No one used them. Everyone had a nickname, usually tied to the place they came from. He was skinny, soft-spoken, barely looked old enough to shave. Came from Knoxville, which earned him the nickname Tennessee the moment he arrived. And for reasons no one understood at the time, he volunteered to walk point. Not once, not twice, but every single day. 3 months on point without so much as a scratch. That wasn't luck. Luck didn't last that long in the Highlands. Luck had an expiration date measured in weeks. Skill didn't explain it either, not fully. Skill could teach you where to look. Tennessee seemed to know where danger was even when there was nothing to see. He walked with an ease that made no sense in terrain designed to kill him. His head tilted at strange angles, as if he were listening to some frequency only he could hear. He didn't rush. He didn't tense up. He didn't flinch at shadows. He moved like he was in tune with the jungle, not resisting it. Olander didn't understand any of it. Not until he became Tennessee's slackman, walking 10 feet behind him, studying every move he made. That's when education started. Tennessee didn't stare at the trail. He absorbed it. He didn't scan the trees. He felt them. He didn't force his way through the brush. He flowed through it, bending branches instead of breaking them, sliding between roots instead of tripping over them, stepping on solid ground instead of soft dirt. Most point men hacked their way forward with machetes, announcing their presence from 100 yards away. Tennessee barely touched his blade. He didn't want the jungle to know he was there. And somehow, it didn't. He'd pause at spots that looked identical to everywhere else. Patches of dirt, clusters of bamboo, fallen logs, and study them like a man reading a map in invisible ink. Then he'd signal a detour. And when the platoon circled back later, they'd find what Tennessee had avoided. A tripwire, a punji stake, a concealed sniper lane, a freshly dug hole, a killing field. Olander couldn't see the signs. Not yet. But Tennessee could, and that was enough. The platoon started to trust him the way Watson's SEAL team trusted Watson, not because he was fearless, but because he survived. in a place where fear was the natural state of existence that made him different, special, essential. The Central Highlands demanded a point man with more than skill. It demanded someone who could listen to the jungle's language, a language that wasn't taught in boot camp, in manuals, or in training ranges back in the States. A language spoken in broken silence, bent grass, disturbed spider webs, unnatural stillness, the angle of sunlight through leaves, the absence of insects, the texture of mud, the scent of water, the rhythm of the trail. Tennessee was fluent. He didn't explain it. He didn't analyze it. He just did it. And Olander would soon learn why. Because what Tennessee had discovered, the thing Watson learned in the swamps and Tennessee learned in the mountains, was the same truth. Walking Point wasn't about bravery. It was about transformation. It was the beginning of something deeper, something the men would later call the zone. And that zone would become the thin line between life and death. The longer Olander walked behind Tennessee, the more he realized something unsettling. Tennessee wasn't just better at Walking Point. He was playing an entirely different game. Most point men survive by brute vigilance, eyes darting everywhere, adrenaline hitting hard, nerves stretched tight like tripwires of their own. They scanned the jungle as if they could force danger to reveal itself through sheer willpower. They watched every shadow, every branch, every leaf, trying to process 1,000 details at once. But that was exactly why so many died. The human brain wasn't built for that kind of overload. The jungle didn't reward frantic scanning. It punished it. Tennessee, on the other hand, moved like a man who had given up the impossible task of seeing everything. Instead, he focused on seeing the right things. And he did it by doing the unthinkable. He slowed down. Most men fought the terrain. Tennessee cooperated with it. He didn't stomp through the undergrowth. He wove through it. He didn't hack vines out of the way. He slipped around them. He didn't break branches. He bent them gently and let them settle back into place without a sound. His steps were deliberate. Not hesitant deliberate. Where others moved like intruders, Tennessee moved like he had a right to be there. Like the jungle tolerated him, or maybe even accepted him. His movements were always quiet, always efficient, always controlled. A man watching from behind wouldn't understand the significance until they saw what Tennessee avoided. A tripwire hidden in a clump of roots. A sniper position masked by leaves. Freshly disturbed dirt that meant a mine was waiting just inches below the surface. A log with its moss scraped clean from someone using it as a firing rest. Things invisible to everyone else. But not to him. Olander tried to understand the pattern. He tried to track Tennessee's eyes, what he focused on, what made him freeze, what made him change direction. But Tennessee didn't look where danger was. He looked where danger shouldn't be. A vine that hung too cleanly. A shadow where sunlight should have hit. A patch of dirt that reflected moisture differently. A plant bent the wrong way with the grain instead of against it. A leaf lying upside down on a path placed there, not fallen naturally. These weren't details you could memorize in a training manual. These were deviations, tiny fractures in the jungle's rhythm. Tennessee wasn't detecting traps. He was detecting mistakes made by the men who set them. The jungle had rules. And when those rules were broken, Tennessee felt it. One night, after a 14-hour patrol through some of the worst terrain they'd ever seen, Olander finally asked the question everyone wondered. How do you see this stuff? What are you looking for out there? Tennessee didn't answer right away. He stared into the darkness, listening to insects buzzing along the tree line. Finally, he said, "Most guys try to think their way through the jungle. That's what gets them killed." Olander frowned. "What do you mean?" Tennessee took a slow breath. "They're trying to look at everything, analyze everything, make sense of every shadow and sound, but your brain can't keep up. By the time you figure out that something looks wrong, you've already stepped on it." He tapped his chest lightly. "You can't think your way through this place. You gotta feel your way through." It sounded mystical, nearly impossible. But Olander had seen too much to doubt him. Tennessee continued, "You let your subconscious do the heavy lifting. You relax enough that the jungle comes to you. You don't hunt danger. You let danger raise its hand." Olander sat in silence. processing the idea. Fear made most men tense, made them breathe shallow, made their senses tunnel, made them hyper-focus on everything, and in doing so, missed the one thing that mattered. Tennessee wasn't fearless. He was just uncontrolled by fear. He stayed loose. His breathing stayed deep. His mind stayed open. His body stayed relaxed. Fear was there, but it wasn't the driver. It was just another passenger. Walking behind Tennessee, Olander noticed how the man stayed tuned to the environment in a way that bordered on supernatural. He reacted to changes before they fully formed. The brief pause in insect noise, the shift in air density, the faint metallic scent that meant a weapon had been handled recently, the silence of birds that should have been singing, the subtle vibration of the ground that signaled someone moving ahead. It was as if his senses extended 20 feet in every direction. Most soldiers would have cracked under that level of focus. But Tennessee didn't, because to him it wasn't effort. It was instinct. He had entered the early stages of something the men later called the zone, a mental state where awareness sharpened, fear softened, and time itself seemed to stretch. Tennessee didn't brag about it. He didn't think of it as a skill. He didn't think about it at all. He had simply walked point long enough that something inside him had changed, just like something inside Watson had. And soon, both men would dive deeper into that transformation. Because the zone wasn't just awareness. It was survival on a different frequency. And the jungle, deadly as it was, couldn't touch a man who had learned to move like that. For weeks, Olander tried to mimic Tennessee's movements, his slow breathing, his fluid steps, the way he seemed to glide through the jungle instead of forcing his way through it. But imitation only went so far. There were moments when Tennessee reacted to something invisible, something silent, something unexplainable. Moments when he froze mid-stride, not because he saw anything, but because he felt something shift in the air. Moments when the rest of the platoon tensed behind him without understanding why, only to find a tripwire, a sniper hide, or a punji pit exactly where Tennessee had changed course. After a while, Olander realized he wasn't watching a skilled soldier. He was watching a man in a state of being most people never reached in their entire lives. A state the veterans would later call the zone, where instinct takes over. The zone didn't arrive suddenly. It wasn't a moment of enlightenment, and it didn't come from bravery or courage. If anything, it came from fear, fear that had been harnessed, reshaped, and refined until it stopped being panic and became awareness. Every point man started out terrified. That was normal. That was human. But for Watson, for Tennessee, and for a handful of point men across Vietnam, the terror didn't consume them. It transformed into something else. It sharpened them. It cleared the mental clutter. It peeled away hesitation. It stripped the world down to essentials. Their minds got keener. Their senses got louder. And the jungle, once chaotic and overwhelming, became readable. Men in the zone didn't think. They perceived. They didn't guess. They knew. The body changes first. What the doctors back home would later describe sounded almost impossible, but the men who lived it swore it was real. Heart rate slowed, not from calm, but from control. Breathing deepened, becoming slow and rhythmic, giving the body a steady flow of oxygen instead of the short, panicked breaths that narrowed vision and killed awareness. Peripheral vision expanded, so wide that some point men could detect movement 50 feet to their left or right without turning their heads. Time stretched. Threats seemed to appear in slow motion, giving their bodies extra seconds to react. To the men behind them, these reactions looked supernatural. But to point men like Tennessee, it was simply the natural consequence of trusting instinct over panic, awareness over analysis, and rhythm over fear. The mind becomes silent. The zone wasn't just physical. It was mental. The rational mind, the part that overthinks, that second guesses, that panics, faded into the background. The part that remained was pure intuition, fueled by experience. Tennessee explained it one night with startling clarity. At first, you're thinking about every step, every shadow, every noise. You're trying to solve 1,000 problems at once. That'll kill you. Your mind's loud. Too loud. He tapped the side of his head softly, but after a while the thinking stops. Your brain shuts up. The jungle stops being your enemy. It becomes information, just flowing at you. He looked at Olander then, with eyes older than any 19-year-old should have had. You don't see it. You feel it, and the feeling tells you where to go. The way he said it, casual, simple, sent a chill through Olander. Because he knew Tennessee wasn't being poetic. He was being literal. Watson felt it too. The remarkable thing was that Tennessee, an Army grunt from Knoxville, had reached the exact same state as Chief Watson, a seasoned SEAL with elite training, different terrain, different upbringing, same transformation. Watson described it differently, but the meaning was the same. You walk point long enough, and your brain learns to listen to the world before your eyes catch up. There were nights in the mangroves when Watson would stop moving without knowing why, only to recognize 30 seconds later that a booby trap was there, perfectly concealed. His subconscious caught it first. He wasn't lucky. He wasn't mystical. He wasn't gifted. He was aware on a level few humans ever achieve. The price of entering the zone. But the zone came with a cost. Men who lived in that mental state too long found it difficult to return to normal life. They couldn't walk into a room without checking exits. They couldn't relax in a restaurant unless their back was against a wall. They couldn't stop analyzing, sensing, evaluating even when there was no danger at all. The zone sharpened them, but it also changed them permanently. For Tennessee, that change meant waking from nightmares that felt more real than the day around him. For Watson, it meant living with an awareness he couldn't turn off, even in total peace. The zone saved them, but it also marked them. Why only the best reached it? The zone wasn't about courage. It wasn't about toughness. It was about repetition, survival, fear managed, not denied, instinct trusted, not suppressed, experience deep enough to override conscious thought. Most soldiers never reached it. Most couldn't. It wasn't taught. It wasn't assigned. It wasn't earned through rank or time served. It was a state only the best point men discovered because they had to. And in the highlands, Tennessee had entered the zone so deeply that the jungle, this living deadly organism, could no longer surprise him. That's when Olander understood. Tennessee wasn't surviving the jungle. He was matching it. And the real test of that mastery was still ahead. A test that involved 3 NVA soldiers, a split-second decision, and the moment Tennessee proved that being a point man wasn't about killing, it was about understanding the rules of the jungle more deeply than the men hunting you. It happened on a humid afternoon in late '67, the kind of afternoon where the air felt thick enough to drink, and the jungle pressed in so tightly it seemed to breathe with the men moving through it. Olander was 10 feet behind Tennessee, close enough to see every subtle shift in the point man's shoulders, close enough to feel it when something in Tennessee's body language changed. And on that day, something changed. It wasn't dramatic. Tennessee didn't freeze suddenly or throw up a fist or slide to one knee. His movement simply softened, slowed, as if he were stepping into a different layer of the world. He angled his head just slightly. Then he stopped. The platoon behind them sensed it instantly. Every man went quiet. Fingers tightened on triggers. Breath held. No one spoke. No one moved. The jungle grew still. And then Tennessee saw them. 3 figures in the green. 40 meters out, through a curtain of bamboo and fan-shaped leaves, 3 North Vietnamese soldiers were moving in single file along a parallel trail. They were close enough that Olander, squinting, could barely make out the shapes' shadows moving in the filtered light. But Tennessee didn't squint. He didn't hesitate. He didn't overthink. His rifle was already rising with a smooth, practiced motion, one continuous line from waist to shoulder to cheek weld. No wasted breath, no wasted effort. The point man's body wasn't reacting to danger. It was anticipating it. The NVA lead soldier stepped into a clearing the size of a bedroom, just a sliver of space where the canopy opened enough to let light through. Tennessee's breathing slowed. His finger tightened. No thought, just action. The rifle cracked one sharp report, swallowed almost instantly by the thick air. The NVA point man dropped like a marionette whose strings had been cut. For a split second, the world held its breath. Then everything exploded into motion. Fight or flight, and Tennessee's choice. The two remaining NVA soldiers spun around, panic shattering whatever discipline they had. Instead of firing, they bolted, crashing through vegetation, making enough noise to wake the dead. Olander raised his own rifle, ready to fire, waiting for Tennessee's lead. He had clean shots, perfect shots, textbook shots. But Tennessee didn't take them. He watched the two fleeing soldiers for a heartbeat, tracking them through the leaves. Then he lowered his rifle. Olander blinked in shock. The platoon behind them waited, confused, expecting more shooting. "Why'd you let them go?" Olander whispered later, after they'd pulled back from the area and regrouped. Tennessee shrugged, not casually, but with a weight that suggested the answer was deeper than anyone realized. "One dead man sends the message we need," he said quietly. 3 dead men brings the whole damn battalion down on us. The rules of the jungle. Tennessee wasn't talking about morality. He wasn't preaching mercy. There was nothing sentimental in his voice. He was talking about balance, the unwritten rules of survival that only point men understood. The jungle had its rhythm, its own cause and effect. Kill 1 NVA point man, and the enemy went on alert. Kill 3, and they came hunting with reinforcements, with dogs, with trackers, with everything they could muster to avenge their dead. Tennessee wasn't afraid of killing. He was afraid of unnecessary killing, because unnecessary killing got Americans killed. And that was the line no point man ever crossed. To the new guys in the platoon, it didn't make sense. To them, war was simple. If you could eliminate the enemy, you did. If you could reduce the threat, you took the shot. But Tennessee lived on a different calculus. A point men's calculus. He understood something the others didn't. Every bullet, every body, every moment of violence triggered a new sequence of consequences. Point men didn't think in terms of firefights. They thought in terms of aftermath. Fear travels faster than bullets. Later that night at the firebase, when the platoon recounted what happened, Tennessee elaborated. "You kill all 3, and they come looking for us," he said. "You kill 1, and they go back scared. And scared men walk louder. They walk slower. They make mistakes." Fear, he explained, was a weapon. A louder one than any rifle. A more powerful one than any claymore. A dead point man made the survivors jump at shadows. A spooked patrol changed routes. An intimidated unit would hesitate at the worst possible moment. And hesitation saved American lives. Olander listened, stunned. Not because Tennessee's logic was complex, but because it was so simple once you understood the reality of the jungle. What seemed like hesitation was discipline. What seemed like mercy was strategy. What seemed like weakness was control. The men who understood. Some in the platoon disagreed. A few even whispered that Tennessee had gone soft from too many months up front. But the squad leaders knew better. They'd seen other point men lose themselves in bloodlust. They'd watched men become so obsessed with kills that they walked the squad straight into ambushes chasing glory. Those men died fast, and they took others with them. Tennessee wasn't weak. He wasn't soft. He wasn't hesitant. He was precise. He was a point man who understood the bigger picture. A man who could kill without hesitation when necessary, but who also knew when killing would cost more lives than it saved. And in Vietnam, that was the rarest skill of all. Because walking point wasn't about killing. It was about keeping the squad alive. And Tennessee had just proven he understood that better than anyone. When the war finally loosened its grip, when the platoons shrank, when the bases emptied out, when the helicopters lifted off for the last time, most Americans thought the men who walked point were coming home. They were wrong. Their bodies came home. Their instincts came home. But the part of them that had learned to move through death's shadow with absolute silence, that part stayed in Vietnam. Because walking point didn't just change how a man survived. It changed how he lived. Forever. Olander saw it first in Tennessee. The same young soldier who had navigated the Central Highlands like a spirit of the jungle now sat quietly on his cot at the firebase, eyes fixed on a spot on the wall that wasn't there. Sometimes he'd sit like that for 10 minutes, sometimes for an hour. He wasn't daydreaming. He wasn't resting. He was reliving. The tripwires he spotted, the ambushes he avoided, the enemies he killed, the enemies he chose not to kill, and the ones he never saw coming, the ones he feared might have been there. A point man didn't carry the weight of the lives he took. He carried the weight of the lives he saved, and the terror of the lives he might have missed. It was a different kind of burden, one that didn't leave visible scars. Back home, no one understood why Tennessee couldn't sit with his back to a door, why he scanned parking lots before stepping out of his truck, why the sudden slam of a car hood made his heart spike like a tripwire had snapped beneath his boot. They didn't understand that his nervous system had been rewired by months of walking 20 meters ahead of death. Point men didn't turn it off. They couldn't. For Watson, the nightmares came quietly, always the same. Silence, wet earth, breath held, waiting for something to move in the shadows. No firefights, no explosions, just the stillness that came before violence. The stillness he'd lived in for 3 tours. Sometimes he woke drenched in sweat, scanning the bedroom like he was back in the Delta. Sometimes he woke choking on the smell of mud that wasn't really there. But the worst dreams weren't of the jungle. They were of hesitation. Dreams where he missed a sign, where he stepped too far, where a teammate screamed behind him, where the booby trap he failed to see sent shrapnel into the men who trusted him. He never had nightmares about dying. He had nightmares about failing, because that was the point man's greatest fear. Not death failure. Failure meant someone else died instead. Tennessee killed more than 20 men during his time on point. He didn't brag about it. He didn't hide it. He didn't excuse it. He carried each one like a stone in a rucksack he couldn't take off. Not guilt, not regret. Something deeper, something quieter, something psychologists decades later would call moral injury. It wasn't about doing wrong. It was about doing what had to be done and living with the knowledge that necessity and morality aren't always friends. Tennessee once said it best, though he didn't mean to be profound. I don't regret a single shot I took, but I remember all of them. He remembered the feel of the trigger. He remembered the moment of decision. He remembered the seconds afterward, the silence that followed violence. Point men carried that silence for the rest of their lives. Why they kept volunteering. To outsiders, the volunteering made no sense. Why would anyone keep walking point, tour after tour, patrol after patrol? Why keep stepping into the most lethal position? Why keep paying the price? For Watson, the answer was simple. If I don't go, someone else will. And he won't see what I see. For Tennessee, it was even simpler. Watching someone die from a mistake you could have prevented is worse than dying yourself. For Olander, who eventually walked point himself, the truth became clear. A point man doesn't choose the job. The job chooses him. Some men had the instincts. Some men had the calm. Some men had the awareness. Some men had the discipline. And all of them knew the horrible arithmetic of war. If the experienced man doesn't step up, the inexperienced man dies. That was the calculus. Cold, brutal, unforgiving, yet unmistakably human. When America moved on from Vietnam, when the news headlines faded, and the country argued over politics instead of battlefields, the point men carried something home nobody else could understand. Not glory, not pride, not medals, but knowledge. Knowledge that they had walked first. Knowledge that they had shielded the men behind them. Knowledge that they had kept their brothers alive. Knowledge that part of themselves was still somewhere out on those trails, waiting, listening, making sure danger never reached the men who followed. And maybe that's the real legacy of the point man, not written in history books, not carved into monuments, not printed in after-action reports. It lives in every soldier who made it home, because a point man walked 20 meters ahead, alone, into the green. The real weapon in Vietnam wasn't firepower, wasn't technology, wasn't superior tactics. It was the quiet bravery of the men who learned to silence their thoughts, open their senses, and step into the unknown. Not for glory, not for honor, But for the men behind them, that was walking point. And that was the burden they carried home long after the jungle fell silent.